Are you concerned about the growing influence of political extremism, hyperpolarization, and misinformation? Well, you're not alone. This is the American Values Coalition podcast, where we explore the root causes of these societal ills and provide you with strategies to counter them.
About a quarter to 20% of white evangelicals who are not on board with that, and they are not all concentrated in like a handful of congregations. They're really scattered across the country and often feel like there's nobody else in their community who is thinking like them, and so they're really isolated.
My guest today is Ruth Braunstein. She is Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Connecticut. She also has a chapter in Trump, White Evangelical Christians in American Politics. This is an edited volume that I bring up because I also have a chapter in this book, and which you will hear more about in a future podcast. A little teaser, so make sure you're subscribed so that you don't miss an episode. But the topic today is not this book or that chapter, but it is a podcast called When the Wolves Came, Evangelicals Resisting Extremism. And this is a podcast that I encourage you to also listen to because AVC is one of those that's featured in this podcast that's discussed a lot in what's in this 6-episode series podcast produced by Ruth Braunstein. So Ruth, welcome to the AVC podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Nat.
Yeah. So what first got you interested in this topic of evangelicals resisting extremism?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, it ties together a lot of threads that I've been studying now for many years. And one of those threads has to do with the backdrop of this story, which is the rising influence of what's sometimes called Christian nationalism within white evangelical spaces. That sort of coincided with the rise of Donald Trump to national power and influence in 2015 and 2016, his first election. And so I've been tracking that sort of within the evangelical world and beyond for many years, in part through earlier research on the Tea Party movement, as well as looking at how many faith groups have pushed back against those ideas. And particularly, many of those identify with what we might call the religious left, or more kind of progressive or mainstream religious organizations that are concerned about the idea that the U.S. would be framed in the sort of exclusionary Christian terms that we associate with Christian nationalism. And so that's like some of the backdrop work that I'd been doing. And so I started a project a couple of years ago that was specifically looking at the organizations working to resist Christian nationalism. And while I was sort of trying to figure out who's who in this world, I started hearing more and more about evangelicals who were insiders in the evangelical world and sort of up close watching this happen and trying to push back against it. And really recognizing that they were fighting a bit of an uphill battle, but we're staying, and we're trying to use their voices to articulate a different vision of their church and also of democracy. And so I really wanted to try and tell that story.
I mean, why the evangelicals? Why not tell the story of like you said, there's folks on the left who are resisting extremism, fighting extremism. What was it about evangelicals or conservative evangelicals in particular?
So one thing that I think is interesting is that a lot of people just don't know that exists. So when we hear about, quote, evangelicals in the news, this is often framed as if it's like a homogenous block of Americans. And so I think that anytime we can show that there's more variation and sort of contestation and debate within any single group of people, the more it helps us see that those are people. They're individuals. They don't agree on everything. They're not like robots or sort of brainwashed cult, right? And so, that's, as an ethnographer, as a sociologist, it's always been really important to me that we're able to see that sort of, that there is debate and contestation within organizations, and we can't paint groups with such a broad brush. I also thought it would be really helpful to hear from folks who are in many cases, theologically and politically conservative who are concerned about this, in part because a lot of the conversation about Christian nationalism, or more generally about the rise of extremism and conspiracy theories, misinformation within the evangelical world or the MAGA movement, gets brushed off by people in that movement as this is just leftists trying to smear us, or this is just people who are have Trump derangement syndrome, and that it's not true, that it's politically biased. And I think that as somebody who is a scholar and tries to be really methodical and not make claims that are political for the sake of a political cause, right? I really try to ground everything that I say and do about any group in data and a lot of research. I thought it was important to hear from folks who were inside of that world and hear their take on things, which, may or may not have aligned with what folks outside of the evangelical world were seeing. But to the extent that maybe they agreed on some things, that people inside and outside were seeing some of the same things, that to me, as a social scientist, meant that was a more valid finding. And I think can give us some more faith that those underlying empirical facts on the ground are true, right? And that people, inside of the evangelical world might have been more willing to see that if it was coming from sort of someone on the inside that they trusted.
Yeah, so you work in academia, so I thought you're supposed to be out there publishing journal articles and books and stuff. And so why a podcast? I mean, you decided to do this as a podcast rather than write a book about it or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, don't tell my department head. No, just kidding. Yeah, no, it was a departure for me, and I do write journal articles and more scholarly things. I just had another book come out on another topic, but this is a topic that's in the news. It's a topic that people are dealing with right now in their churches and in their communities, and the speed with which politics is moving is really astonishing. And so I felt like doing research for a couple years with activists who are busy and thinking about the kind of severity and pressing nature of these issues, and then in 10 years writing a book, just really felt like a mismatch for this topic. I also felt like this was a topic that had a really broad audience. That there's a lot of people who are thinking about these questions. They may not be thinking about them in the same terms that scholars are. And as if you've listened to the podcast, we don't get into a lot of the debates about like how to measure Christian nationalism, right? We're not grappling with some of those scholarly questions, but I think that at a basic level, the questions of like, what does it mean to be a good Christian? What does it mean to be a good American? How are people actually having these conversations on the ground in complicated, messy ways? I think is worth trying to tell to a bigger audience than just a scholarly one. And then I think I'll just say that the podcast medium really appealed to me. A lot of my work is ethnographic, and the sort of job of the ethnographer is to try and paint a picture for their readers of the people that they have spent years studying. And podcasting just felt like a really kind of immediate way that an audience was able to get to know people that they may not have a lot of contact with in their daily lives. You get to actually hear their voices. And, there's an intimacy to that. And so I felt like, especially for something as complicated as this story, where you're maybe hearing things from people, if you're an evangelical, you may not hear a lot from sociologists, and hopefully they got to know me and where I'm coming from a little bit better. If you're not an evangelical, you may not hear a lot from evangelical pastors like Caleb Campbell, who we spent a lot of time following in the podcast, and so maybe they hopefully feel like they got to know him, and others that he's working with like you. And so yeah, I think that there's real value to that medium.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think there is sort of an intimacy when you have like their voices in your head that's different than like just reading their words. So who are you thinking of as the target audience when you were creating this?
We really had two different audiences in mind. And one of them was the kind of typical NPR listener who is pretty well versed in these issues. You've probably read a number of articles about, Christian nationalism and about religion and politics, but who maybe didn't have that kind of on the ground insight into the people who were grappling with these issues in their communities or in their everyday life. But we wanted to be able to speak at a level of generality and make the kind of insider lingo legible to folks like that. Um, and then we also wanted to speak to people who are inside of faith communities and thinking really hard about this. Again, when we talk about, white evangelicals are by far the most likely to ascribe to Christian nationalism and to support Trump and et cetera, there's still a big chunk of white evangelicals who don't, right? About a quarter to 20% of white evangelicals who are not on board with that. And they are not all concentrated in like a handful of congregations. They're really scattered across the country and often feel like there's nobody else in their community who is thinking like them. And so they're really isolated. And so, hopefully being able to lift up the voices of some of the other people and, Caleb Campbell in the podcast and you and your organization talk about sort of sending up signal flares to other evangelicals who might be feeling concerned about some of these same issues. And so, I think that we've gotten some really nice responses from people in that position who were grateful that they were able to hear the podcast and know that there's organizations and individuals around the country who are thinking about this in similar terms as them.
So I'm curious about the time frame of how this came about, because you came to visit our conference in Atlanta in July.
Mm-hmm.
Were you already planning the podcast at that point, or when did this sort of come about into fruition in your mind that you wanted to do a podcast?
Yeah, so I've been working on the idea for a couple of years now. And one of the first things that I needed in order to do a podcast with the level of, I really wanted it to be kind of a documentary style podcast, which was way out of my sort of comfort level and skill set. And so I worked, for a long time with a funder trying to figure out what we might be able to do within a budget that was reasonable. I was able to get a grant to support hiring a really amazing production company. I worked with a company called the Mashup Americans, who makes, content like this for lots of different kinds of creators, and had the technical skills that I needed, because I had, I barely know how to plug in this microphone before I met them. And so, that process started probably a year to year and a half ago, that I started some conversations with them and just thinking through the bigger research project that this was a part of, which again was about mapping this field of resistance to Christian nationalism. It took us some time to kind of narrow down what a story might look like and sort of how to even tell that story in a way that might be compelling. And so by the time that we met, I'd been talking to folks who I had sort of encountered in my research, just having lots of one-on-one conversations with different evangelical leaders and folks in different organizations, and they kept pointing me your way. And so, I think that one of them connected us. And when I heard AVC's story and particularly got to know Caleb, it really felt like this was a way that in sort of one main character, so to speak, we could bring together a lot of the threads that we'd been sort of thinking about as part of this story. And so that's kind of how it came together.
So anything that you learned in the process, anything in particular that surprised you, or what are some of the major takeaways from this whole project?
I mean, podcasting is really hard. I don't know how you put one of these together as often as you do. There's a lot of technical stuff happening behind the scenes. And so, I had worked with this brilliant team of, almost 10 people total who all had different specializations and, are amazing at storytelling and sound design and fact checking and editing, and right, there's so many different parts involved with creating particularly a documentary style podcast. And I learned so much. And I really think that it's an amazing medium that more scholars should think about using, because, we definitely reached far more people with this podcast than I would with a typical piece of scholarly writing. And so that was really exciting. I also learned a whole lot about, the topic. I've been researching this for longer than, I want to admit, but, since grad school, really. So almost 20 years. And I still was really moved by the stories of a lot of the people that we talked to in the podcasts. And, these are folks who are inside of evangelical churches and really just trying hard to be discerning about this political moment and to continue going back to their basic faith commitments and to check all of their kind of impulses in this society that we all have toward partisanship. And, I thought that there was some really good modeling of how to do a different kind of politics in this moment. And so I think that regardless of where people's politics are, in terms of whether you're liberal or conservative or in the middle, we all need to be better at that kind of discernment. And Caleb said something that really stuck with me, that we all need to get more practice learning how to suffer each other. And, that's something I think about every day.
Wow. And so you said you've been studying evangelicals politics going back to grad school?
Yeah, some of the really early projects that I worked on, I was really interested in debates around same-sex marriage. I wrote some papers that never got published, kind of course papers about debates about the theory of evolution and intelligent design. And yeah, so, this is something that the sort of long arc of particularly more conservative faith communities and politics in the United States is something that has interested me for a long time.
Is that from, do you have friends that are evangelicals, or where did that interest come from?
Well, I talk about this a little bit in the podcast, but I grew up in Georgia in the South, and I'm part of an interfaith family. I was raised Jewish, and my dad's side of the family is Catholic, and so we sort of celebrated everything. And I also went to, at the same time, a private Christian school for middle school and high school, and so I really felt like I had a foot in sort of Jewish, Catholic, and Protestant worlds growing up, and was always just sort of fascinated by differences between them. And, I probably was training from a very young age to be a sociologist of religion because of that. And so, yeah, so I had a lot of friends growing up that were evangelical. I went to Young Life youth group during school free periods. I went to Christian summer camp. And so, yeah, it was always just such a big part of the culture that I was exposed to. And I was never a part of it per se as an insider, but I was able to kind of hang out along the edges of it and watch. And I always found it really fascinating in many ways. And so when I got much older and moved away and saw that evangelicals in particular were such a major part of our national political debates, I had a lot of questions about that and wanted to understand it better.
Yeah, I'm curious what your reaction was to the first time Trump got elected. So for me, I'm an evangelical working for an evangelical publication, studied the Christian right in academia. I should have a thorough, thick understanding of this movement, and I still felt like I was caught off guard by like that initial Trump support, and then how it became even stronger over time. So I'm wondering if you saw something that I didn't as well, or if you were also caught off guard.
Well, I mean, I think we were all caught off guard a little, like
Yeah.
nobody, I think, would have predicted where we are today. But at the same time, I think I was slightly more prepared for it, in part because I had spent the past many years researching the Tea Party movement. And one of the things that was really interesting about the Tea Party movement, and that I'm actually writing about now in hindsight, is that I think it served as a bit of like a fulcrum in our move from a kind of the traditional religious right, sort of conservative Christian political mobilization that you're, an expert on, and then today's MAGA movement, that we can't quite get from A to C without B, and B is the Tea Party movement. And I think the reason for that is that the Tea Party was not the religious right, but tons of people who identified as part of the religious right, as conservative Christians, as white evangelicals, participated in the Tea Party movement. But they did that alongside a bunch of secular libertarians and people who didn't care all that much about religion. And what tied them together was this shared idea that the real America is under attack. And what was the real America? They talked about it in these sort of more general terms as our Judeo-Christian heritage and, the vision of the founders. There was a very strong reverence for the founding fathers. And so I saw in the Tea Party the seeds of what, today we would call white Christian nationalism. But it was much more of a kind of Judeo-Christian colorblind nationalism at that stage. They tried very hard to be ecumenical. They worked very hard to be colorblind in the way that they talked about this. And so because of that, I think I saw the seeds planted for someone like Trump to come along and be able to bridge those divides as well. At the same time, and I will say that the Tea Party hated Donald Trump when he first came on the scene. And in fact, the leader of the Tea Party Patriots, one of the larger national organizations affiliated with that movement, gave a pretty significant speech before the Republican primary in 2015 saying that Donald Trump hates the Constitution and that he, goes against everything that the Tea Party stands for. And then he wins and they get on board just like everybody else. But, there was this moment when maybe he wouldn't have been their guy, but I think that there's a lot of reasons why folks in that movement supported him. And it's because of the kind of idea that the United States is a Christian nation under attack and it needs to be protected at all costs.
Yeah, and also on the Never Trump Republican side, there are a handful of former Tea Party Republicans like Adam Kinzinger and Matt Walsh, not the Eagles guitarist and singer, Matt Walsh, the congressman, who's been very outspoken in his opposition to Trump and was originally part of the Tea Party movement.
Yeah.
So I'm looking forward to hearing more, when you do more research on that. So I am encouraging. I loved your podcast. I'm encouraging everybody to listen to it. We've been out there helping to promote it as well. There was one thing in there that I did disagree with, so I wanted to ask you about. So it's toward the very end when you're kind of summarizing the entire podcast, the end of episode 6. I'm just going to read what you said I copied and pasted from the transcript. You said, quote, "There are organizations that have been hard at work to protect pluralism and combat religious extremism for decades. These are groups like Americans United for the Separation of Church and State and the Southern Poverty Law Center. They would be within their rights to feel frustrated that it took many white Christian groups so long to heed their warnings. Still, many of these legacy resistors have welcomed newcomers to the work with open arms. These collaborations send a clear message that no matter how long it took you to get there, if you're ready now, then let's get to work." So there's 2 disagreements I have with that. The first is the notion that we're late arrivals. I mean, for me, I'm not late to the party. This is, I've been advocating for pluralism. A lot of evangelicals like me have been advocating for pluralism for a long time. And also, a lot of these groups, like the 2 you mentioned, have not been particularly good on pluralism. So I would say they're late to the party, and maybe not even have arrived to the party yet. Particularly during the Obama administration, the Masterpiece Cake Shop case, the Little Sisters of the Poor case, they were not on the side of pluralism in a lot of these episodes that happened during the Obama administration when you had they were not they're very good at pluralism for people they agree with, but not so good for people they disagree with, which makes me wonder if you're really for pluralism at that point. So I that's I want to explain my disagreement, but also get your reaction to that.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great point to think through because this is really one of the challenges that I see to building that big tent kind of coalition in defense of pluralistic democracy. And right, to really think about, can pluralism, or the fight for pluralism, include groups that are historically in the majority, right? And or is the fight for pluralism really just about protecting the voices and the rights of minority groups, which I think is part of the tension that you're getting at. And that's a really hard conversation. One of the ways that I think it's helpful to come at this is by thinking about the fight for the separation of church and state. And so one of the kind of new developments in recent kind of pushes by the right is to just deny that there was ever a kind of intention to have a separation of church and state. And I think that on that point, some of the civil liberties groups have been kind of attuned to those threats for longer than most Americans have really seen that threat as being real. And so people who are kind of on the front lines of the legal defense world. And so that's sort of the piece of that I was mostly kind of thinking of when I was making that statement, that, right, we're all kind of, and I put myself in this camp too, kind of newly aware of the kind of full frontal attack on the idea of the separation of church and state. On the question that you raise, I really think that that's got to be a bigger conversation inside of a broad-based pro-democracy movement. And one of the reasons that I think will be really hard, but I think we should do it anyway, has to do with the way that religious freedom has really been weaponized by the right. And it's been used as a way of defending what, in my view, is religious privilege of groups that have historically had that privilege, right? Legally, culturally, and in terms of other kinds of power. And so when Christians say that their religious freedom needs to be defended, and what they're really talking about is their ability to impose their religious sort of views, culture, and laws on others, right? That's where people get nervous. At the same time, I really want a pluralistic democracy where all people, including conservative Christians and mainline Christians and Catholics and Mormons and right, every single group has an equal place at that table, right? And where we can have robust disagreements about lots of issues, including about, basic issues of conscience. My new book is about tax paying, which seems off topic, but one of the issues that I write about has to do with longstanding movements by both the anti-war movement and the anti-abortion movement, who both raise really identical concerns about the use of their tax dollars to pay for something that they view as morally abhorrent. In the case of the anti-war movement, it's war. In the case of the anti-abortion movement, it's abortion. And, that those both have to do with these questions of individual conscience and whether or not, we, as a society, are willing to acknowledge and respect those kinds of individual differences of conscience, where the boundaries are around that, kind of whose conscience we pay attention to. And so, I think there's any number of debates where we're having all different kinds of groups at the table to talk through those issues can be helpful and increases the legitimacy of the resulting policy decisions.
And one of the things I remind my evangelical friends is that being in favor of pluralism is part of our heritage as evangelicals. I mean, going back to the founding of this country, one of the reasons we have pluralism in this country is because evangelicals were the minority, strange religion at that time. So it was partly out of their own defense, they were advocating for pluralism, because if we did have a state religion, it wouldn't have been evangelicalism. So this is definitely a big part of our heritage, even going back many years, to advocate for pluralism from an evangelical faith perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like I talk about this a lot with my students, but we maybe don't talk about it enough, kind of like with broader audiences, that the category of quote unquote Christians is a category that would not have necessarily made sense to the founders, right? When they were thinking about religious freedom, they were thinking about these much smaller sects of Christianity for the most part. And there were, of course, other faiths that sort of had communities in the United States, right? George Washington assures Jews that their religious freedom would be protected too. But the idea that all of those Christian sects would unite, and then they would further unite with Catholics as this big overarching category that we call Christians today, is a really kind of new idea. And it's one that, I think if we trace the history of it, is strategic, and gives that group a lot of power in our politics, but sometimes leads us to misremember what some of these founding ideas were about.
Yes. So again, the podcast is When the Wolves Came. Thank you so much for joining us. So you did mention you have a new book out about taxes. For anyone who's heard that and, their ears like, oh, I need to, get a hold of that. What's the name of it? Where they find it?
It's called My Tax Dollars, The Morality of Taxpaying in America. And you can find it anywhere you buy books. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining the ABC podcast. And thanks again for your podcast, which I think was, did a lot of, a great service to helping get the word out about what we're up to.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much, Nap. And thanks for participating in the podcast and telling ABC's story.
Thank you.